Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. You get that if you have Netflix. We've just read chapter 2 of Mere Christianity, and we're going to jump into it. I hope you're actually reading it because it's pretty awesome, and I feel like while Thomas Aquinas' proofs might have been really difficult, Mere Christianity is really simple, it's very personal. You just have to actually take the time to read it and think about it. Now, chapter 2 starts off by talking about objections he got. If you remember, this was a radio broadcast. So Lewis was getting, he would do a broadcast over the radio. It was in parts, and then people would write in or call in and kind of say their critiques or their compliments to what he was saying. And so the biggest critique he was getting was, isn't what you're calling the standard of moral law or the standard of right and wrong, isn't that just our herd instinct? And I hear this all the time from students at school, right? Like, look, we as human beings have this instinct to protect and sympathize with other people. All animals have that. Like monkeys sympathize with monkeys, dolphins with dolphins. I'm trying to think of other animals. I've heard this, dogs with dogs, right? Like all animals are kind of brought to their own species as something worth protecting after their desire to protect themselves. I remember one time a student said, if a dolphin, which is a creature that often helps people or protects people, if a dolphin saw a human and another dolphin in danger, it would go help the dolphin first every time because it has the instinct to protect its own species. So that's what Lewis is talking about when he's talking about this herd instinct, this desire to protect one of your own herd. And Lewis, as you've read in the text, doesn't deny that that's true, right? Like he doesn't deny that we have this herd instinct. But to say the moral law is simply the herd instinct, he says, doesn't seem to follow with how we experience this moral law. And so he gives 3 objections to why it's not just a herd instinct, right? The first one is because we often feel multiple instincts at once, right? So there's an example of if I was walking past a burning building and I heard someone screaming for help, right? I would immediately have 2 instincts arise in me. Their instinct to go help that person, right? Because there's a person in danger and there's a person in pain and that just hurts you to hear that. And so there would be an instinct to go help them. But then there would be another instinct to run away, right? Because you're like, flames are hot, flames hurt. That guy could die because the fire, if I go help him, I could die. So I should run away and stay safe, right? Every normal person would feel both of those instincts fighting within him at once, right? But the moral law, he says, isn't one of those instincts because the moral law is often telling you which instinct to pick. It tells you you should or you ought. Lewis loves the word ought. You ought to go help him. You ought to help the person in the burning building. You ought to help the person drowning. If someone, trips and falls and drops all their books, part of you might be like, I have the instinct to help them because I feel bad for them. Part of me has the instinct to, not help them because I don't want to look like an idiot. I don't want to look like a loser like them. Not that they are a loser. But the moral law says you ought to help them pick up their books. You ought to save the person in danger if you can. So the moral law seems to be this third kind of thing that tells you which instinct to pick. The second reason he says that it can't just be this herd instinct or a herd instinct is because he says that if it was just 2 instincts battling at each other, if you just had 2 kind of urges within you, the stronger urge would always win, right? Like if it's just 2 biological impulses, the stronger the impulses is going to win. The weird thing about the moral law, though, is it doesn't always pick the strongest impulse, right? We probably wish that it often would. But the problem is, it often picks the weaker one. And it often tells you to wake that weaker instinct up, right? Like, there's that person in danger. You think, I ought to go help them. I feel a slight urge to go help them. But I have a greater urge to protect myself. I have a greater urge to kind of hide, from this danger. And that urge is overwhelming. I'm sure there's been plenty of moments in y'all's lives where you've been afraid, but something in you tells you you need to go do this. But the fear is very felt. The fear is overwhelming, but yet the moral law tells you to go out and do it anyway. And so Lewis is saying that if it was just 2 instincts, it wouldn't be the weaker instinct that wins, but yet the moral law often tells you to wake up that weaker instinct and go do that which is weaker and ignore or fight against that which is stronger. The third reason Lewis says that it can't just be the herd instinct is because there's no instinct that's always good or always bad, right? So that's the interesting thing. Like the sexual urge is an example he uses, right? Most people feel the sexual urge, right? And there are times when it's good to act on the sexual urge, and there's sometimes that it's bad to act on the sexual urge. But if the moral law was just an instinct, that wouldn't make sense that it's sometimes good or bad, right? Rather, there needs to be this outside thing. I believe it's this part of the book that he uses the idea of like a note, like a set of sheet music for like piano, right? Like there's all the keys, all the instincts, right? But the notes tell you which key is the right key at that moment. Right? So, for instance, with the sexual urge, if you're walking down the street and you see a person, a person you're attracted to, and the sexual urge is awoken, right? That is the time the moral law would say, "Don't act on this urge. You're in the public. You're out, in the street. That's not a good time to do that." But if it was your wedding night, right, and your sexual urge is awakened, the moral law would tell you, "Yeah, go with it. Like that's the right thing to do right now." And so it's interesting, he says, that there's not always a good or bad instinct. All the instincts are rather neutral, right? And yet the moral law tells you when one's good and when one's bad. It's interesting, anger. There are times when it's good to be angry. There's times when it's good to have sexual desire. There's times where it's good to feel sympathy. There's times where it's good not to feel sympathy. And that's what's interesting, like even like if Thomas was older and in my class and he, had a bad grade on a paper for me, there would be an urge in me to not punish him, to give him a good grade as opposed to a bad grade. But that instinct, which is normally good, the desire to protect my child, is actually immoral at that point. The moral law would tell me to ignore it at that moment. So the second thing, sorry, I got to pull it up so I'm making sure I'm covering all the things. What example does Lewis use to prove that being taught something from parents or teachers does not make it a mere human invention? Yep, so this is the next thing, right? Like, if the moral law isn't just an instinct, then it's just what my parents taught me, right? Like, we just have ingrained in us from our culture that these things are right and these things are wrong. And once again, I think this is a moment where Lewis would say, yes, our social conventions, what our parents teach us, does affect what we view as right or wrong. But it's not the core of what the moral law is. Right? And he wants to then compare the moral law to mathematics. He loves bringing up that example because mathematics is objective, and he wants to show the moral law is objective. And he says, just because your parents teach you something doesn't mean that it's not objectively true. So, for instance, your parents, he uses the example, your parents teach you mathematics, right? Like, or your parents do, or your kindergarten teacher, or, whatever, I think it's first grade is addition, second grade, third grade's multiplication, whatever it is, you were taught multiplication, but yet it's objectively true. Theoretically, you could have discovered it on your own, right? But yet your parents taught it to you or your teachers taught it to you. The same would be true of like vegetables, right? Like vegetables have nutrients in them. They're healthy foods for humans. That's true regardless if your parents taught it to you or not. Now, hopefully your parents found out that vegetables are healthy for you. And once they found out they're good for people, they made sure that you ate them before you, learned that on your own. It would be a weird parent who said, eat whatever you want, child. And when you get older, you discover what's healthy. Rather, a caring parent would say, no, I want to get you what's healthy and good for you now when you're at this fundamental stage of development, and not wait until you can discover it when you're older and wiser. So the moral law, he says the same thing. Just because your parents teach it to you doesn't mean de facto it's not objective, right? So you would have to kind of prove it's not objective on another means than just saying our parents teach us right and wrong. Because if it's real and objective, good parents would teach you right and wrong, and bad parents would fail to do that. And then the next question is saying, how do we know it's not just merely a social convention? Because that's, what Lewis, is trying to deal with here too, because people say like, okay, it's not a herd instinct, it's not just what my parents teach us, but it's just what society teaches us. And he says, well, this doesn't work for two reasons other than the whole parent thing. Number one, as he said in the last chapter, almost every society in human history has had a very similar moral law. The basic core principles are all the same. I've never met anybody who kind of rejects most of the 10 Commandments, right? I've never met anybody who says like, oh yeah, adultery, that's great. That's the good thing to do. There's people I know who've committed adultery and they have excuses for it, but I haven't met anybody who's like, yeah, adultery is the good, fidelity is the bad. So there's this core moral law that we all have, all cultures, all history. The second reason he says that it seems like the moral law is not just merely a social convention is because we talk about certain societies being, more progressive or they're more moral than others, or that a certain society progressed in the moral law. So if you said that Americans were, American culture is more moral than Nazi culture, right? You're applying an outside standard, because if you're saying there's a more or less, this is like the fourth proof. If you're saying there's a more or less, there's some kind of objective feature you're applying it to here. If you say, for instance, I think this is one that's hard to, deny, that America progressed morally as a society when we made slavery illegal. As in, before, when slavery was legal, we were less moral than afterward. Then you're applying some standard here. Very few people in the world would say, like, oh, that was just a legal change. Or, nope, fundamentally the same in both sides. No, like, the moral law said that slavery was bad. And so when we said, the moral law says slavery is bad, so when America makes it illegal, it's like we got a little closer. When civil rights passed and there was more equality legally, it's like we're getting closer and closer to that moral law, right? And our goal is to get right to it as a society. You could also say this thing about things that even like the Catholic Church would be opposed to. Talk about, like, if you think when gay marriage was legalized that America progressed, that's still utilizing a moral law. Even if you disagree with, a lot of the things that Lewis would argue on a Christian level, if you think we progressed there, or if you think we progressed when abortion was legalized, or whatever various other issues it could be that, there might be, disagreements in your theology class, those are all looking to a standard still. So it's interesting that it's hard to get out of this idea of a moral standard. The final thing that Lewis talks about is, why is it not a moral advance to not execute witches when they're not real? Because he's just saying, when you don't think something's real, then clearly there's no real moral judgment to make. Whereas if you thought witches were real, then you probably would think we should kill them. But the fact that you think people were wrong for killing witches because you don't think witches are real, yeah, it's just not a very valuable judgment, because you don't take for real what they're saying. But if you did think it's real, then you would, think, if you thought that there was some, person who lived in your neighborhood who was casting spells on your family at night, you probably would think we should do something to them, to stop them from casting those spells. But since you don't think that's logically possible, the idea that you would abuse anybody for being a witch is immoral, because that's impossible, you would say. I don't know. I didn't think about witches before doing this video, so I have no idea. So anyway, there's the video for today. We'll move into chapter 3, and then we'll, go to spring break. The first 3 chapters are kind of the arguing about this standard. The 4th and 5th chapters are what kind of start trying to point towards God. So the first 3 are just trying to do that. So we'll get that in before Easter, and then after Easter we'll get 4 and 5. I hope you're enjoying the book. I hope you're enjoying these videos okay. If you have any questions, let me know. There will be a quiz after this, and the quiz will just cover various questions from the topic. But I might also ask you, like, I did this in the last video, like specific examples I used, right? So like when I was talking about that first section, and I was telling you about like someone in a burning building or someone drowning, but then I also said someone dropping their books in the hall. That would be a good little thing just to make sure you watch the video. So yeah, make sure you got my examples. All right, guys, God bless. Reach out to me if you have any problems. Oh, and just so you know, it turns out they're going to be live streaming the Shroud of Turin on Holy Saturday. So that's something that they, usually the Shroud of Turin is not out to even view if you're in Turin, but they're going to be live streaming it over the internet. Catholic Church is doing a lot of cool live streams right now. So check it out on Holy Saturday. I'll post a link somewhere so that you can get it. God bless, guys.